Elizabeth, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled to be in the staff room.
This is where it all happens. We met a couple of years ago when you were publishing your novel, The Party. And I think, like a lot of people, and as Dolly Alderton said on your podcast, I met you and I just thought, look at this tall, beautiful, successful, smart, erudite woman. Look at how she's just winning at life. And now I've read How to Fail. I know that if I look at the timeline, you had been through quite a lot of stuff actually by the time I met you. And that, of course, this image that we present to the world hides the real story of what might be going on. You've been through all sorts of difficult things and you've talked about them in your book and in your podcast. Were you surprised, first of all, about the success of that podcast, how the idea of failure has chimed with so many people?
Hugely. And first of all, thank you so much for saying that. That's such a lovely thing to hear. It's quite rare that you hear someone talk about their impressions of you 2 years on. And you're absolutely right that I had gone through some stuff at that stage. And I remember that evening very vividly because The Party is my fourth novel, and my previous novels I'd obviously been extremely fond of and put a lot of work into, but they'd never done exactly what I had dreamt that they might do. And The Party was really the breakthrough for me because it became a bestseller, and that was a really wonderful thing and felt successful. But as I explore on the podcast, success might not feel as one expects it to all the time. And that internally one often feels one is doing a whole heap of stuff wrong and failing on a very mundane level every single day. I mean, the other day I failed to hold a yoga pose that I normally hold, and I know that that's the most trivial example, but it was so annoying to me. And it was annoying to me on two levels. It was annoying that I couldn't hold the pose, and it was annoying that I wasn't like living by my own philosophy of failure, which is actually learning how to fail is learning how to succeed better. And that's a long-winded way of coming around to saying that the success of the podcast was a huge surprise to me because I had really done it from an extremely personal place. And then to find that personal thing connect on such a universal level was a really beautiful discovery and entirely unanticipated.
You mentioned, you're quite open at the beginning of the book actually, where you say that there could be a criticism of sitting down to talk with very successful people about their failures, because of course we know that they always end up eventually successful. But there is something actually quite honest about the fact that all people fail and succeed in their own way. Wouldn't you agree? Is that?
I totally agree with you. And the reason I chose quote unquote successful people for the first 8 was because I know I was a totally unknown quantity. So if anyone was going to listen in, it would probably be because of the lure and the pull of the name that I'd got. And I think that there's something actually very democratizing about having a successful person admit to failures, because you can aspire to that person from a distance, but then actually to hear them talk about how their 20s were a nightmare, or how they really had to deal with being rejected from the university of their dreams, or job loss, or divorce, or infertility, or failing at driving tests. Actually, that's a very reassuring thing. But as the podcast has progressed, I have expanded my remit a bit. And so now I do have people who aren't necessarily household names. They might still be very successful in their own fields, but they have really gone through the mill. And the one that really sticks with me is Johnny Benjamin, who's now a mental health campaigner, but who was standing on the edge of Waterloo Bridge a few years ago about to take his own life. And hearing from someone like that, I think, is incredibly powerful.
It's interesting you mention him because listening to that episode and thinking about what might unify all of these podcasts in a way was that for a lot of people, it is getting down to the very, very bottom. It is reaching that point that is the spur for them to then move up and to achieve real success in their lives. Is it really actually only through failure that one can succeed?
I think that you can succeed without having failed, but that you won't appreciate it as much as you will do if you failed first. And that for me is part of success. Success isn't just earning enough money to travel in a stretch limousine. It's also having the human experience that got you there. It's also being able to connect with other people through vulnerability. And it's also acknowledging that life is texture and there are going to be rough patches along with the smooth, but that all of that added up is quite a beautiful, intangible experience. And that's what makes us human. So success for me is all of those things wrapped up. And so I do think that if you failed, not only do you appreciate success more, but you sort of know how to handle it a little bit better, because there's that sort of famous saying, and it comes from kind of Taoism and Buddhism. Just mixing up my isms there.
It's definitely an ism. We know that.
It's definitely, it's not Thatcherism, but it's Buddhism or Taoism, about things being just what they are. It is what it is. So success and failure are facts until you attach emotions to them. And it can be an incredibly liberating thing to treat them both equally, to treat them both simply as experiences that you're observing how they make you feel. And you don't necessarily have to automatically assume that failure is an unrelenting negative. And you certainly don't have to define yourself because of it.
Reading the book as a man is quite an interesting experience. And that's because obviously you talk about some very important experiences for you as a woman throughout your life, actually, through your childhood and young adulthood, and then obviously to where you are now. And there's a chapter called How to Fail at Anger, where I found myself getting quite angry on your behalf because...
Thank you, Will.
Well, no, because you're talking about your experiences with trying to become a mother and the time in your life where you were, I suppose, reaching that point at which the biological clock is really ticking, and that some time was wasted basically by a relationship. I think that's one of the really important messages of this book is for men to realise the many ways in which they are making women's lives very, very difficult. Because you talk about body image and body shaming and things like that. Were those kind of things quite hard for you to write about, honestly? Or did you just have to confront it and say, right, deal with it?
I'm actually so glad you picked that chapter, Anger, because it was the one that came most easily to me. And it was also the chapter that I hadn't intended to write. It hadn't been in my synopsis.
Right.
And I just found myself in the midst of writing this book. And then I realised that there was this particular thing that I wanted to say. And that chapter poured out of me because I realised that I had been so angry for so many years, but that as a woman, there had been a social conditioning that had meant that I didn't feel able to express that anger in its rawest form. I felt that I had to appear to be nice and pleasant and I could transmute it into sadness, but I never really faced it. And it was when that relationship ended with a man who was 9 years younger than me, who decided to break up with me on the eve, really, of my 39th birthday, that I felt devastation and then I felt pure fury. And it wasn't directed at this individual, it was directed to a sort of broader social issue, which is that I think we don't teach boys or girls enough about fertility. And I was completely clueless. I mean, most of my sex education was revolved around the very serious notion of not getting pregnant. I mean, that was the main thing. And I was never taught that I was born with a finite egg reserve, and I was never taught that what IVF involved. And that was really, it was a very tough realization for me when I came to it. And I'm so glad that that's been your response as a man having read the book. Thank you for that. Obviously, I can only write from my particular perspective, which I realise is a very privileged perspective. Number one, I'm a white middle-class woman, and I'm not a man, and I can't talk with any sort of experience, and it would be patronising to try, about the conditions that other people find themselves in, whether that be a man, someone who identifies as trans, a person of colour, and I'm very aware that my experience is extremely specific. Having said that, there are lots of women I know who hugely relate to the issues that I'm discussing. And in answer to your question, which was, did I find it hard? I actually found it necessary. And therefore I didn't, I mean, obviously there were patches that I was writing about that were uncomfortable for me personally and upsetting, but it's actually very cathartic as well, because it was the first time that I was able to explore all of those issues in my own voice, in my own space, with a really, really big word count. Because in my day job as a journalist, I always have to write to the behest of an editor and I only have a certain number of words. So it was actually incredibly liberating doing those chapters.
I could talk to you all day,
Ditto.
but I can't. But I so enjoyed reading this book, not only for what I learnt about you personally, but some of the guests on your podcast, but of course, inevitably through reading it, you learn something about yourself because you start thinking about your own failures. So as you say, it really is a book for anybody who's failed, and therefore a book for everybody.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you for being a male reader.
Well, that's my pleasure. There's a lot for men to learn from that book, so I hope they read it. But for now, Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you.